standing in. That's not got it. Okay, so I'm standing in for our chair, Richard Astle, this morning. Until he arrives, he sends his apologies for his being delayed. So our meeting today consists of 4 presentations, followed by the AGM and the forum. And in advance, I'd not only like to thank those presenting, but also Peter Lanshoff, who conjures up these NC forum meetings, and also thank Helen Dye, our NC's coordinator, who aids and abets Peter, who ensures that everything's in place and works, and does much more besides to keep Natural Cambridgeshire on track. So just to remind you, I guess you all have the agenda. So today we're going to be hearing from, first of all, Sean McGeever about COP26, and then we're going to hear about the Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Climate Commission from John Shropshire, then from Alice Midmer about land use in Cambridgeshire, and then Sarah Smith about the work of the National Trust. Getting feedback from someone. Could you all mute, please? Could you all mute, please? There's feedback. And finally, we're going to have the AGM of Natural Cambridgeshire. So now I'm very pleased to introduce I must say that each of the speakers has been given an allocated time for their presentations, which actually gives us quite a lot of time for questions and discussions after each. So I'm now pleased to introduce our first speaker, who is Sean McGeever. He's Deputy Director, Access, Landscapes, Peatlands and Soil at the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. And on his LinkedIn page, it says, I lead a team that is looking at how we use protected landscapes, peatlands and soil in the UK to reverse biodiversity loss, improve people's lives and combat climate change, which I think covers most, if not all, of the interests of Natural Cambridgeshire. So we look forward to hearing from you, Sean. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Roger, and good morning. So you gave me the title of talking about COP26 and the path to net zero. I'm going to talk specifically, I think, about the areas that I work on, if that's okay, because that's what I feel that I'm able to do so. But just to give you a sense of that, so I run a division called Alps, which has actually got nothing to do with the Alps itself, thankfully, because it wouldn't be very relevant for me to be working in DEFRA if that was the case. But it stands for Access, Landscapes, Peatlands and Soil, which are the policy areas that I lead on, as Roger sort of outlined. As part of that also, I lead on, my division leads on 30 by 30. So this is the commitment to protect 30% of our land and sea by 2030. And I work on the terrestrial bit of that. So it's about how we're going to achieve that and how we're going to get there. And I also cover a little bit of work on the overseas territories. So we have a program called Darwin Plus that supports biodiversity in the overseas territories. So for those of you who follow those things like eradicating mice from Gough Island, we manage the fund and the project for that, although we don't do it ourselves. That's RSPB doing a fantastic job. As I understand it, they have just completed that, so no more mice, and they've just been introducing Gough Island bunting back in, so that's fantastic. And a little bit on Hunting Act, particularly around trail hunting and so on. It sort of sits in my division because it didn't have a home elsewhere. But the majority of what I drive to do is what Roger explained. So I thought I would just put this in the context of COP26 and net zero. So as you know, the government has published its net zero strategy, which is wide-reaching. The bits that I am most focused in on that are around essentially land use change. Is probably how you can sum that up, not including trees. And the 3 main areas that I'm looking to deliver and push the policy on are one, I think, is that probably the most impactful is the England Peat Action Plan, which, if you haven't seen it, is published online. That's one of my teams that's produced that. And as part of that, we're looking at peat restoration. So we have a big Nature for Climate Fund peat restoration grants and peat restoration discovery grants, which we're going to announce this week. But I know if any of you are involved in those, you will have already got notification of whether you've been successful. And that's something which we'll see ramp up in the next 3 years in terms of the amount of restoration that we have to achieve. And it's the ambition is we think about as far as we can push it in terms of the capacity to deliver. Sorry, I think someone's got their mic not muted. There we go. Yes, I think it was Edward Darling. Thank you. So we've got a big program to restore peatland, and then we've got, as part of that, and we're in sort of slightly earlier phases of that, is how we transform, because we're going to need to do that, how we farm and manage collectively the lowland agricultural peat, and I'll touch on that in a little bit. And that's probably particularly relevant for Cambridgeshire. And I think actually when we launch the discovery grants, it's going to be in Cambridgeshire in terms of where the project that's been successful there. The second one is soil health. So I have the soil health team in my division, and there's a huge amount of interest in soil health at the moment. Interestingly, the team doesn't sit with the ELM team or the future farming team, because actually it's much sort of broader than that. And we provide all of the advice in terms of how we're going to measure soil health, how we're going to drive for better soil health, and how we're going to incentivize people to farm differently so that we can improve that. And that's all around organic matter and increasing moisture content, but quite a lot of different messages on the science in terms of how much carbon can be sequestered and captured in soil. Some of it's around science, some of it's around permanence. So how do you keep it there? So that's something that we're working on and looking at how we can also maximize what goes on there. And obviously there'll be lots of overlap with regenerative farming and no-till farming and so on. And then the third bit, which I look at under my division, is protected landscape. So this is national parks and AONBs and the role that they will be able to play, increasing role that they will need to play in delivering against climate change. And this is adaptation and mitigation. And as part of that, we have, as you'll know, or you may be aware, was the Glover Review 2 years ago, and we're about to put a response out on that. And part of what we want to do there is strengthen the purposes and put more focus and emphasis on delivering against some of these national targets around climate change, net zero, but also biodiversity, and how we can make these places work with land managers and landowners to get closer towards achieving those targets. So that's the main sort of areas that I deal with in terms of COP26. I'm aware, Roger, I think I've got 10 minutes, haven't I? So I'll try and keep it relatively brief and then leave it open for questions, because often that's probably more useful. So I'll just sort of go over some of the questions that we're trying to answer in terms of how do we deliver this. I think capacity is a big issue. I touched on that in peat restoration. We are behind tree planting in peat restoration in terms of having, we don't have a peat commission or Peat England like they do with Forestry Commission and Forestry England, but we have the same issues in terms of that whatever we do has to be essentially done on private land. So it's about working out how we work with private landowners and delivery organisations to have the capacity to restore. And in some cases, it's about giving the certainty for people to invest in machinery or to hire people for more than 6 weeks, etc. So it's about trying to set that policy direction and give that certainty so we can build that capacity. And around all of this, as I said, is engagement with land managers and landowners and farmers and etc. How do we create those partnerships that benefits everybody and allows people who own and manage land and get their livelihood from it to continue to do so in a way that also delivers for nature. And looking at your website, it seems that's very much the kind of thing that you're also you'll probably be grappling with as well. The second thing that we try and answer is how do we fund this? And the sort of big thing on the horizon, the juggernaut coming towards us, is ELM. We have a couple of things that are pre-ELM. So if you are based in an AONB or a national park, you may be familiar with Farming in Protected Landscapes, which is a program that my team run. That's a sort of, it's using future farming money. It's relatively small, but it's trying to work out a model that we can deliver on the ground to really start to bring people into this, the way of thinking that we're going to need to the transformation and the transition that we're going to need to bring about if we're going to achieve these targets and support people through that particularly. The second one is creating a framework for philanthropy. So are there barriers to work being done that are regulatory, that government have an influence over, in terms of people coming in with philanthropic organizations or third sector NGOs or etc., that are stopping people from making the change that they would like to make happen on their land. Their tax disincentives for turning farmland into more nature-based approach, etc., that we can work on. So that's an area that we're looking at. And then the final bit is, how do we bring in more private investment? How do we bring in people who want to offset their carbon credits, companies who want to get involved in biodiversity, net gain? How do we bring in investment into places? How do we get a system that takes what is essentially a little bit Wild West at the moment and brings some order and de-risks it and uses the brands that we have to really try and make something that can work? And there's huge potential there. And we have a number of different avenues that we're pursuing. Having said all that, when we talk about COP26, we're often thinking about emissions, and emissions are really important. But what we have possibly not been focusing on is adaptation, and that's something that increasingly we're looking at how we do the two elements of that. And peat is a really interesting example of that, because what we do for mitigation is the same as what we do for adaptation. So the risk, if you look at the CCC report on risks for adaptation, the risk to peatland is that we will get drier conditions and the peat will dry out and it will emit more. I mean, for those of you not familiar with peat, peat is the emissions from degraded peat in the UK are roughly equivalent to the amount of carbon that all the trees absorb. So if we have, it's a huge source of emissions if we don't get it right. In terms of to reduce those emissions, we need to re-wet the peat or keep it wet. That's exactly what we need to do for adaptation as well. It's all around water supply and how we manage water. The upside of that is also, if we get that right, we reduce flooding, and we also adapt to sort of more intense rainfall. So it's trying to bring all of those things together under one policy. And just to finish, and I'll finish now, Roger, and open for questions, is trying to bring all of these things together. And what I try and do is try and keep in my mind as much as possible a vision of what that's going to look like. And it's quite a full-on vision. If you think about the scale of land use change that we're going to have to do in order to meet our net zero target by 2050, it is huge. The change, particularly in the lowlands, in terms of how we farm, how we manage water level. There's so many questions around that, but it's going to have to be significant if we're going to reduce the emissions. At the moment, there's about 10 to 11 megatons of CO2 emitted from peatland and I'm just using the peat as an example, in the UK. 86% of that is from the lowlands. Roughly 1 hectare of lowland peat emits 19 times more carbon dioxide than 1 hectare of degraded upland peat. So these challenges are huge, and how we make those shifts, we don't know yet. It's almost like this is technology we haven't invented, in the sense of, if you bring about the sort of social and economic and business model change that we're going to do. But we try and keep that in our minds so that we know the scale of what we have to do, and that we try and make sure that what we've got in place is a set of policies. And government isn't going to do this alone, but a set of policies that helps people transition in a way that's sustainable and that doesn't disrupt their business model. Because we still need to be able to farm, we still need to be able to grow food, and we need to be able to keep rural economies and farming agricultural economies thriving, and if possible actually put them in a better place than they would be if we don't do these interventions. So I'll stop there, Roger. That's sort of a summary of my world of how to deliver on COP26 and what I'm working on. It doesn't provide you with all the detail. Some of it I do have, some of it I don't, but I'll leave it open to questions. I know we've got limited time.
Many thanks, Sean. I see Richard's joined us. I'll just start off the questions, Richard, let you get your breath.
Thank you.
Thanks indeed. Sean, that's really interesting. I mean, I was a civil servant many years ago, and then Department of Environment, and we used to face across and really face off with the Minivac Fish and Food, and it's so good to have all these in one family these days. I mean, it's to an old lag like me, it's a new world and a brave new world. And I hadn't heard that fact before, that all our peat emissions are equivalent to all the CO2 the trees are absorbing, and that is quite worrying. Well, very worrying indeed. Well, we've got 2 questions, or probably 3 questions posted. The first one from Peter Lansop is, how will you target methane?
It's a good question. I mean, mostly it's about avoiding producing methane by for me at least, by overwetting peatland and overwetting lowland peat particularly. If you get the big challenge is, how do we get the water level just right? If you get it too high, you start producing methane, and if you get it too low, you produce carbon dioxide. So that's where the main challenge is for me. But in my sector particularly, we're only targeting it in the sense that we're trying to avoid overshooting what we do on carbon dioxide and actually making a worse problem. And that's one of the questions we're trying to answer, which is tricky. Through the work, actually, I don't know if I mentioned this, but some of you may be involved in this, with the Lowland Agricultural Peat Task Force, which is led by Robert Caldwell, and that's a sort of across the piece group of people, farmers, Environment Agency, NGOs, ENGOs, etc., working together to try and answer some of these questions.
Thanks, Sean. There's a second question here from Daniel Zeichner, our MP, and he asks about, you mentioned elm in passing. Can you say more about how they used to tackle lowland peat issues? I guess your last answer was part of that.
Yeah, I mean, so the elm is really interesting. I mean, I know it's just been a launch of the SFI standards, and it's had mixed reviews, certainly on the social media and the other bits of media that I've been following. There are 3 elements to elm. There's the SFI standard, and there'll be local nature recovery, which more will be published very shortly, I think. It may have even been, I know we've been working on some of the wording on that with the elm team. And then the landscape recovery. I think a lot of what we'll do on lowland peat will fall in the local nature recovery strand in terms of what it will do. Certainly the stuff on paludiculture, which is the wet farming, will be funded through that. Ultimately, once we get past 2024, this is going to be the main source of funding to make a lot of these things happen. That's the plan at the moment. Right now, we've got the Nature for Climate Fund, and that's doing stuff like discovery grants and so on that are working on lowland peat. The Nature for Climate Fund works. It works really well at the moment. The intentions is that will move over to elm. I think it's certainly my view, and those who work on Nature for Climate Fund, that we won't want to do that until we're sure that elm can deliver in the same way. This net zero work is too important to leave to put to something that is untested. So it's going to be we're going to have to work out the timing of that transition, but ultimately elm will need to pay for those public goods, that is essentially, reduced emissions to people who would otherwise farm that land. And we'll also need to support the transition to other ways of farming or changes in economy that we may need to do, or that other people may be interested in going into. But short answer is we don't know. We haven't worked that out yet, and we're working it out over the next 2 or 3 years. But hopefully we have other mechanisms to support that in between, which we're not going to let go of until we know we have something in elm that's going to deliver.
Thanks, right, Sean. I'll just pose the next question, Richard, then you're happy to take over. The next question really touches on what I said about, how pleased I was to see so much more joined up working now than there was then. But Sue James asks a question: is there areas of government activity that you feel would benefit from more joined up working between departments?
I mean, always. The way we're set up in government, for those of you who've worked in it, it is difficult to get cross-government working. You have to work quite hard, and it doesn't happen naturally. And that's because of, each department having its own minister, and ultimately making that's the decision-making structure. And I've worked on cross-government funds where we've had boards, and we've tried to get around this. So there's no perfect way of doing that. I think in the case of, there's a couple of areas where we're now trying to work more across departments. One of them is access to the outdoors, because obviously that's something that, you know, falls under local government, falls up the Department for Transport. There are planning issues, there are infrastructure issues, there are designation issues. We're talking about, you know, national parks and parks in cities and so on. And that's something that where DEFRA is at the centre of that, and my team are trying to bring all of that together. I think that's something that we can do a lot more on, particularly with the new planning reforms in terms of how we bring departments together. It's not easy. In terms of if we bring it back to your point, Roger, about farming and environment working together, I think it is great that we're in the same department, but I wouldn't say we have finished that journey. And I think you probably find that out in real life, you know, outside of the sort of weird world of policy, that there are ends of the spectrum that are quite far away, but ultimately there's this increasingly growing overlap, and I think it's a really exciting area, and it's one that we're going to have to get right if we're going to put the balance back to where it should be. And you know, it's really, for me, an exciting time to be working on this, because there's so many movements and ground, to use the word, there's a groundswell of change in terms of how we think about the fact that we're farming in the natural environment. You know, the things are linked. The ecosystem, the economy is a subsystem of the ecosystem. You know, all of this has to come together. But I wouldn't say we're quite there yet, either out there or in the policy space. And the ELM is forcing us to work this out at the moment. I feel that we're getting there, but we've got a few more steps to go, even within the same department. So yeah, walking across government is difficult. I hope that answered the question.
Thanks, Sean, and hello everybody. It's Richard here. I'm sorry to be late, and thanks so much, Roger, for standing in while I was there. Sean, I didn't, I'm afraid, catch all of your talk, but it sounds like it stimulated a lot of questions. So I'm just going to do a couple more quick questions, and then I think we'll move on, although the next speaker is incredibly relevant to everything you've been talking about, so this conversation will flow. But I thought I might pick up Pippa's question in the chat, actually, because it's an intriguing one, not only about how you work across departments, and you know, as Roger's pointed out, there's been some progress there, and yet there are still some, you know, some cultural shifts to happen and some partnerships to be forged. But what about working vertically in terms of the framework with local governments, and how, you know, how we slice it that way? Is that very much on your agenda, and in terms of achieving sort of the net zero targets and the biodiversity goals?
So, I mean, absolutely, and that's a real, you know, that is a, you know, at the crux of it. So all of this is going to be delivered at a local level, and you know, at the local level there's different, as you all know better than I do, you know, there are lots of different complexities that come in, and lots of different, you know, competing pressures. So how we create from central government a framework that allows that local system to work optimally is going to be key. And you know, and there are a couple of things that we're looking at now, and I don't know how, we're going to have to see how they work. I mean, one of them is the local nature recovery strategies, and how we make those work, and as a means of bringing people together around a set of issues that, you know, everyone can get behind, and then how those are then used a little bit to bring in to shape how the funding and the delivery happens. So whether that's through your biodiversity net gain funding, your ELM funding, external finance, you know, philanthropy or private finance, trying to get those plans just right is going to be really critical. And there's still some work going on. I know there was a consultation in terms of what we include in the framework for those. You know, how much of it is just about local nature recovery, and how much of it is about climate, how much is it about access, heritage. You know, how do you map all of those things over them? And then in my area, there's another complexity, which is that you've got national park authorities, and where national park authorities cross across local government boundaries, but national park authorities don't have their own LNRS, so they're going to have to work across sometimes 6 or 7 local government areas, and you know, and work on 6 or 7 local nature recovery strategies, but with their own management plans. So all of this has got to be unknitted, but I think there's quite a lot we can do there. The other thing is that I'm interested in is how the planning reforms, they've been paused, and there's quite a lot now coming out of DLUC, which we're engaging in terms of how we green the planning process, and how we build in structures that bring together different departments on the ground, so that we have to work together more closely on some of these green issues. And I'm actually quite, given what I've seen and what I've been asked to contribute to, I'm quite encouraged with how that has changed since the leadership of that department has changed.
John, that's really interesting. I've seen a lot of questions in the chat, which I'm actually going to defer. John, you might want to make sure you're looking at the chat, because quite a those are around about peat. And I think you might be one of the best placed people to talk about that as part of your presentation. But if I could ask one final question to you, Sean, from the chat, which is from Cameron from the Environment Agency and a great friend of Natural Cambridgeshire, just to talk a little bit about what action is being taken to promote and secure more private sector funding and investment in this agenda. I think that's a really interesting one for us here at Natural Cambridgeshire, because it's something we're anxious to pursue. It would be interesting to hear your views on that.
Okay, well, we're still working it out, but we have a few things that are going already. So we've got a green finance team that's led by my colleague Helen Edmondson, and they have a number of funds that they bid for, but that are also running. Got investment readiness fund and so on. That's going to help people start that process. In my neck of the woods, it's about what we do with, and particularly on Peatland code. So how do we create a framework that allows people to at least to start to prime a market based on one set of rules, and what rule, and there are other rules coming out around there, but I think government has a really strong part to play in this, and how we make that market go from voluntary to being a proper viable market for carbon in peat, for example, is going to be really important, and then in soil is going to be important. But there are other things that we're doing. So we, as part of the stuff we do on national parks, you may be familiar with an organisation called National Parks Partnerships, and that's a company that the National Parks UK have set up specifically to bring private finance into local projects. So big international private finance in local projects. They just launched a fund called Revere, which I think has got initially Santander and Estee Lauder have committed, I think, 160 million to. And the idea is that they using the brand of the parks, and if we develop it how we want to, AONBs and then beyond, to really bring in a pipeline of projects and marry them up to the finance that comes in, and de-risk the whole model. So for the landowner who probably thinks, I've no idea how to engage in this, it provides advice and says this is how it's going to work. For the investor who says, how do I know I'm not just buying a pig in a poke? He says, well, we're associated with national parks and so on. We're not going anywhere. So if we get this wrong, you know where to find us. And so that's essentially how those are the sort of various areas that we're going to really try and accelerate massively. I mean, just to finish on that, we have been given a target by Treasury in this spending review, which it's probably not public yet, but it doesn't matter, a significant target in terms of how much private finance we need to bring in by 2035 and how much by 2050. And that's a very, very ambitious number, which we've signed up to. So we're going to be really looking at how we can do this and work with people on the ground to make this work well and take out some of the wild westery of it all.
Really interesting. Oh, I love that combination of brands, Santander and Estee Lauder. I need to think about that a bit more, actually.
Well, interestingly, they go through quite a lot of due diligence before they partner to make sure that the corporate social responsibility values are aligned to what we're trying to do.
Absolutely.
So I'm not sure we're going to have the sort of Pepsi Peak District National Park just yet, but
I was just thinking about that sort of Peatland fragrance that I might be wearing in sort of 6 months' time. That might be a good time to sort of move on. Sure, thank you so much.
In the meantime, you can dab a bit of single malt.
Lovely. Thank you so much, and thank you for your time and for joining us this morning. Please, if you've got time, we'd love you to stay on, but obviously we understand you're a busy person. Thank you.
I will. Thank you.
So we're going to move on to the second item on the agenda, and it's my great pleasure to welcome John Shropshire to the forum. John and I have worked jointly on the Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Independent Commission on Climate, and John is also chair of Fenland Soil, and I've forgotten what the acronym stands for already, John, but again, you'll talk about that, which is addressing one of the key issues that we've already started discussing as part of the conversation today. But we thought it would be absolutely right to invite John, representing the Commission, to come and talk to us today about the final report that's come out from the Independent Commission on Climate. And indeed, as you can see from the very second word of the title, the fact that nature features very, very prominently in the thinking of the Commission on how we address climate change. John, thank you for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you, Richard, and good morning, everybody. So I've got a bit of a cold, so I'm going to sound a bit husky, but I'm going to hopefully get through this okay. So I was asked to talk about the aims of Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Combined Authority in terms of reaching its net zero targets as a commissioner. So I'm actually going to not apologise at all, because I'm going to actually take 12 slides now that are basically taken from Baroness Brown's presentation that she made when she launched the report back in October. Now, many of you will have actually seen, most of you should have seen this or will have seen this. So I'm not going to spend too much time on these first 12 slides, because I think, given what Sean was saying, you're probably more interested to hear from me about what we're doing about the peat issue and farming in particular. So I'll concentrate a bit more on that. So Helen, the next slide, please. And the next one, please. So the emissions in Cambridgeshire are more than the national average, which is a major concern, and this doesn't include the peat. So actually we've got problems on emissions without the peat, and Cambridgeshire has more lowland peat than any other county in the country. And they're also, the emissions in Cambridgeshire are falling more slowly. Thank you. Obviously, the concern about rising temperature, water shortages hit this region significantly, because we're already the driest area in the country. Thank you. And I think the biggest worry, of course, is flooding and the cost of that in terms of people's lives, businesses, and just the sheer cost of keeping the water out and dealing with the flooding. So that's the biggest concern really in terms of impact, is the flooding. Thank you. We have actually got in Cambridgeshire, to meet our targets, to have a massive lot of work to actually achieve our targets. You can see that we're a long way off where we need to be by 2030. And this is a really serious issue. Thank you. So the Climate Change Commission was set up, and it's actually tackled these areas, and it's nicely laid out in this presentation on the right, you'll see. But we want to get multiple benefits from the work that's going to be done. More green space, healthier homes, cleaner air, higher quality jobs, growing the green economy, better public transport, and improved health and well-being. So this is all great and really terrifically beneficial, but there's a lot of work, as I say, to achieve that. Thank you. So a huge task ahead. Transport, over 500,000 cars. Well, we have a plan on cars, don't we? So that's probably the one area that's almost sorted. Transport with lorries is a big issue for Cambridgeshire, and there is no solution for lorries yet, but no doubt over the next 10 years with technical advances, then there will be. Buildings is a huge issue. We're still building houses, new houses, that don't meet anywhere near the standards that they should be. So, and we're going to build a lot of more new houses in the next few years in Cambridgeshire. And, you know, this is a really urgent requirement to get this sorted out. Now, the cost of this, just for these issues alone, is reckoned to be about £700 million per annum over the next 10 years. So this is a huge investment that's going to need to be made. But of course, there will be savings as you use less energy. You know, energy costs money, and there will be savings. And then, of course, land use, re-wetting and restoration of the peat. and of course, green spaces and nature. Okay, thank you. So local government does have a key role. Obviously, we're totally dependent on government for a lot of issues, particularly in agriculture. But local government does have a key role to play in transport and planning and home renovation and these sort of issues, and coordinating the key stakeholders. So there is a substantial job to be done by local government, communication engagement as well, and making sure that the national support is used effectively locally. Thank you. So if we look through a bit more detail, the infrastructure, for example, on EV charging, it's all very well buying electric cars, but we've got to be able to charge them. So the charging infrastructure, commitment to getting buses, taxis and council vehicles to net zero, to zero emissions by 2030, and reducing car miles. So, you know, safe cycling routes, public transport, particularly cycling is only going to really be a drop in the ocean. It's public transport is the key thing that's really got to be focused on. And getting, you know, just in terms of clean air, getting electric vans and things into our city centres in particular, with home deliveries, so many home deliveries now. And that's something that we've got to be aiming for. Thank you. On buildings, we need to try and get all new builds to be net zero ready as soon as possible, and the target is 2023. So the then, of course, local area energy planning for heat decarbonisation with community involvement. I think we've got good examples in Cambridgeshire of that. I think Swaffham Prior is a leader in that as well. And we've got to get existing buildings up to standard, and that's probably a much bigger job, is getting the plan for all older buildings or even recently built buildings. Okay. So on energy and water, the local area energy plan is developed by stakeholders, distribution companies, consumers. You know, that is a major task, and working with Ofgem, of course, and Ofwat. I mean, water is a really serious issue for the whole region, but particularly for Cambridgeshire, so the south of the county in particular. And there is a plan by Water Resources East to actually try and solve that issue, but it's going to be expensive, and it's going to need quite a lot of work to get it through. Thank you. So moving on to peat, we have established a Fenland peat committee, and we've basically, our aims are a whole farm land use for climate change mitigation, adaptation and biodiversity enhancement. We need to update the mapping. I think Sean quoted some numbers for emissions from peat. Well, actually, they're only really estimates. We don't really know how much the Fenland soils are emitting, because we actually don't really have an accurate view of how much peat there is left. In fact, a lot of the peat has actually already disappeared. So we don't have an accurate view. So the mapping is a key task. And we've searched, you know, we're seeking funding for research to fill in these gaps, and to actually also develop best practice guidance for farmers. So what we've set up is Fenland soil, and the words, so it's okay, you can go to the next one. Yeah. So the word soil stands for sustainability, opportunity, innovation and learning. The farmers actually on the commission are particularly innovative, and they are very proactive in this subject, and there's a lot of interest, a lot of excitement really, because I think a lot of farmers see the opportunities in this, in being able to change the way they operate, change the biodiversity on their farms, and you know, meet their own requirements really in terms of possibly making money out of carbon sequestration through the ELMS schemes, SFI, as Sean was talking about. So they do see a lot of opportunity in this. There's no question. Thank you. So what's been achieved so far? Well, we've employed a full-time member of staff to coordinate the group, and we've financed 2 flux towers to measure emissions. And the one on the top left there is actually in an organic field of grass. And this is a grass ley. And what was very interesting, picking up on what Sean said, this was put in place in April. And we could see as soon as the weather dried out and the land dried out, even with grass, so there was no cultivations at all, obviously, the emissions just shot up. So the peat soil here is emitting substantial amounts of CO2, even though it's in a grass ley and not being cultivated. And it was down to the dryness. So you could almost inversely see the correlation between dryness and emissions. As soon as it rained and the grass started growing, then the CO2 emissions fell. We've set up farmers dialogue work stream. As I talked about earlier, there's a lot of input to that. We've had lots of farmers getting involved, and we've also tried to get lots of people to come and visit. We've had probably a dozen visits this summer of different people who are involved in the Lowland Peat Task Force, for example, and local interested parties to come and visit. We've also worked with Cambridge University to support their NERC bid, and we will be hopefully heavily involved in supporting that work over the next few years. And I'm a bit worried about whether I'm actually really allowed to say this, but we have been successful in winning our Natural England Discovery Grant bid, which actually, as Sean mentioned earlier. So that is a really big step forward. Okay, next one, please. So the Discovery Grant gives us fantastic opportunities to actually tackle this peat issue, because what we have as a vision for farmers is a mosaic of solutions. So obviously, I think, as Sean said, we want to be able to continue farming. I think Sean actually said that. We want to continue producing food. The Fens produce 7% of the country's food. So we want to continue farming, but we want to substantially reduce and in places eliminate the CO2 coming out. So we need a whole a mosaic of solutions. And we see that as part of that, that parts of farms would potentially be taken out of production. So we'd select parts of land that were more difficult to drain, wetter areas, porous land, take those out of production. And the vision that we have in this group is to actually do this through grant schemes, but enabling the farmers to retain the freehold of their land, so the government then doesn't have to buy the land, but pays the farmers to turn it into wetlands and to then manage it appropriately. And also, of course, paludiculture would come into those areas as well. So this whole project is basically aiming to achieve that mosaic, which would also include regenerative agriculture techniques on the land that continues to be farmed. So minimum till, less ploughing. There's no doubt about it. The flux towers tell us as soon as you plough, cultivate the soil, the CO2 strikes up. So this is a really exciting project, and one that we're basically just about to hopefully get started with in this spring. The biggest challenge of the whole lot is water, because if we're going to re-wet this land, we're going to need a vast amount of water. And that is the biggest challenge, because the water is even the work Water Resources East are currently doing to put 2 very large reservoirs in, that is not going to solve the problem that, for this particular issue of rewetting the peat. So water supply is going to be a really big challenge. And I think that's it really. I've got obviously there were questions on the chat that we can pick up on, Richard. I think one of them, actually, I should just say, somebody said that G's actually have moved production abroad. That was actually really in relation to labour, you know, the labour issues. So we have moved a small amount of spring onion production, which our spring onions are grown in Worcestershire. So that was because of the shortage of seasonal labour. We moved that to Africa. Some, not very much. We don't want to move any if we can help it. We want to farm in Britain. So we have moved some. So I think that's probably where that came from.
John, thank you so much. Helen, can we take the slides down so that we can then welcome everybody back into the gathering? It's a little bit easier to see everybody. I wondered maybe while we're doing that, John, we had a question earlier from Graham North around farming clusters. And how you go about farming those and sorry, forming those, farming and forming. I think it'd be interesting to hear about that. And also, I think perhaps maybe just being candid, I mean, where are the pressure points? I mean, you know, we know there are many farming communities and landowners like yourselves who are well on board with this agenda, but I would suspect there are others that are not yet made those steps. And how are we going to sort of manage that and bring those people with us?
Yeah, I think farming clusters is a really good point. I mean, the Discovery grant, we're actually focusing on 3 IDBs, internal drainage boards, and the farmers, we've got a large chunk of the farmers in each of those IDBs actually supporting this bid, and we're going to have to create some sort of cluster there. There is a cluster around Ely of fen farmers that are actually, it's the can't remember the name of it actually, the Nature Friendly Farming Group, which has made a really great start, and I think that that is something we can build on. But there's no question about it, clusters is an important way of dealing with this issue, because if farmers have got to get together, if we're going to raise water tables, it's got to be done in an area. We can't just try and manage each field separately. It's got to be areas of different farmers working together through the IDBs. So that's definitely important. And the second question, Richard?
Well, more really, I mean, just candidly, I'm sure there are many farmers like the ones you've mentioned that are well on board with this agenda, but there's probably as many who are yet to join us, and how do we go about overcoming their fears? And I think, you know, we can absolutely empathise with them. We're asking people to change quite significantly what they've done for generations. Yeah,
well, I think the Lowland Peat Task Force set up by DEFRA does stipulate that we want to keep farming and keep food production. So it's, but you know, maintaining the confidence of the farmers that they're still going to be needed. But what is clear is they're going to have to change. So I think our farmers dialogue group that we've got locally is really important to try and get. What we need is to get some leaders in the farming community to actually put in new processes and regenerative farming techniques to re-wet parts of their farms, and then, you know, keep showing all the other farmers, and then eventually, I think I mean, you know, if we look at regenerative farming, an amazing job's been done. You've got groundswell. I think the first year of groundswell down at Royston, the farmers there that started the regenerative farming movement, they had 200 or 300 visitors of farmers. You know, this year they had thousands. So what, you know, once you get a ball rolling, it will keep going. So I think that's important. And of course, farmers, you know, they're actually having a tough time financially. They're not doing that particularly well. So I think there's obviously going to be financial implications of this. And, you know, we've got to have some sort of grant aid support for farmers, particularly if they're going to take land out of production. And some sort of assurance maybe that in the future it could, because you know, the sort of part of that vision is we take land out of production and put it into reed beds. But I think the one great thing is that actually potentially if there's a national emergency and we needed to actually put that land back into farming, then we'd retain the agricultural capability of that land. So, and we don't, then the government doesn't have to pay for the freehold, which is a big factor. And it was mentioned in the chat as well. The land, I mean, there's a bubble in land values like all assets at the moment. Land is overpriced. It'll no doubt come down, but it's still a big number, even if it halved.
John, that's great. There's a couple of really interesting questions in the chat. One from Tim Brightmeyer, who's one of the trustees at Natural Cambridgeshire and sits on the board. He's asking about someone just put another question in, so he's disappeared off my screen.
Right.
He's asking about green fertilizers of the future and their role in helping at the productive capacity of the holding. Do you have a view on that at all?
Well, no question about it. And yeah, I mean, we've got to reduce, nitrogen fertilizer is a big factor, isn't it? And I think, you know, we're not even really, not many farmers are even looking at scope 3 yet. You know, we've got farmers saying, oh, well, I'm already net zero, but actually they don't look at scope 3 and the amount of, you know, the CO2 implications, which has been clear in the news recently when the price of gas has gone up, the fertilizer price has doubled. So we know where the fertilizer is coming from. So it's a big factor, and there's no question about it. But you know, technically, they mentioned CCM, and Tim does well. That, you know, that technology is going to help us solve some of these issues. There's no question about it. So I think that's always an opportunity. Technology centered around Cambridge. We should be world leaders in this, and I think we will be.
There's a few questions in the chat. There's one that I think is quite intriguing. It's a nice, simple question, but important one from Matilda. If you change from farming peatland from arable to livestock, what sort of level of difference does that make to carbon emissions?
Well, we have found grass on this organic farm where we've got the flux tower actually still emitted a large amount of CO2,
right?
Because the grass does dry the land out massively.
Yeah.
Because as you know, you've got ground cover all year, and I don't know. I mean, at the Great Fen, they're going to be doing more research into this, but we need to know. And we've only had these flux towers now for a year, so we're going to find out over the next 2 or 3 years what is the difference between arable farming and grass. We don't really know. I think in a dry year, grassland farming can produce quite a lot of CO2. We've found out. We think it's going to be nearly about 18 tons a hectare on that particular field this year. But we had a very dry spell in sort of June, July, which was during, you know, and the grass just completely stopped growing. We had a lot of CO2 coming out then.
And we know from the work we did on the commission that those dry spells are going to become more frequent and more intense. So that's a major factor.
Yeah.
Question from Pippa about water. You mentioned, John, that the WRE strategic plan doesn't take into account the demand for water. Was that deliberate and therefore an exclusion, or is that a conversation that's ongoing? I mean, Pippa's point is that we need to make sure that all water demand is made explicit in our planning.
Well, I think that there's no doubt, possibly, I'm not totally accurate, some of it will be, there'll be some available, but it's more for irrigation than actual re-wetting. So if we're going to re-wet the fens, we're going to need a very, very large amount of water. But I think what we need to do is that through the mosaic of solutions, we need to focus in on the deep peats, because it's the deep peats that are going to be producing the most CO2 for the next 30, 40, 50, 100 years. The shallow peats are going to actually be gone by, a lot of them will be gone by 2050. And the wasted peats, there's no peat left anyway. So getting that accurate mapping and then targeting those areas, we don't necessarily need to try and flood everything. You know, I think that's really what we need to work out. We need to target and create this mosaic and concentrate on the deepest peats that are emitting the most carbon dioxide.
There's quite a bit of chat on this in the chat, and some people answering some questions. Tim was just going to come in. He's got a thought on this. Tim, did you want to reply more directly to Matilda?
It was only just to say that I have heard the figures quoted in terms of carbon sequestration, that a ploughed field is 30 tonnes a hectare, Minimal cultivated fields about 70. Grassland livestock farm about 135, and woodland about 175. So it does show just to what extent grassland, probably not in the fens necessarily, but grassland elsewhere is an extremely good sequestration of carbon.
Yeah.
Thank you. And Martin Baker has very kindly put in that actually, as everything, the answer to most questions is it depends, and depends on the species composition. So I think there's also a question in there, John, so I do want to be fair to everybody, from Wendy, just another comment on your own holdings. You might want to reply separately that, so I don't want Wendy's question to be ignored, but I think it's more for perhaps you to reply separately in the chat if you'd like.
Okay, yep.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think with respect to our other speakers, I am going to move on. That's been an incredibly helpful conversation, John. I think it's you know, it seems very positive to me. I mean, there's a lot of energy in all of that. I mean, huge challenges ahead, but a lot of energy, a lot of positivity. And I think the work that you're doing to sort of bring, you know, your fellow landowners and farmers with you is hugely important. The only thing I was going to add, though, is do we need to do more with any of the institutional landowners? And I include in that, you know, the county council, Peterborough City Council, the Cambridge colleges, etc., to make sure that they are coming with us on this journey. Perhaps that's one you and I can discuss separately. But I think it's really important that the big institutions are buying into this, and probably literally buying into it.
I just briefly, Cambridgeshire County Council are very heavily involved.
Good.
In this group, and are really supportive. So yeah,
that's great to hear.
Yeah.
Thanks, John, and thanks for all the hard work you're doing.
No problem. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you, everybody. So we're going to move on. I mean, we could go on with both those first speakers. We could carry on for quite some time, but actually the agenda we've got is full of very, very linked and important conversations. So the next part of our agenda is to look at what's entitled on the agenda land use in Cambridgeshire. So we've almost started on that to some extent. But I'm not going to say any more other than to introduce our speaker. Alice, are you the speaker, or is Dame Fiona the speaker? I can't see Dame Fiona, so it's possibly you.
It's me.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Just to praise, say though, in a sense about what you're going to say, I think the initiative that you and Dame Fiona are leading is a hugely important part of everything we've just discussed. If we don't plan how we use our land, then you know, we're not going to, you know, we're just sort of hoping for serendipity that it all comes out in the wash. We need to take a very, very strategic approach, and it always amazes me that we're very carefully planned for the hard infrastructure, the housing and the roads, but we don't seem to have a plan for the soft infrastructure, which is so important to us for so many different reasons. So Alice, I'll leave it with you. Do you have a presentation, or are you just speaking?
I'm just speaking. That's
Lovely.
right, Richard. Thank you very much. Thanks, Richard. And also, yeah, just to echo that, yeah, really, really fascinating to hear those two talks, and particularly from John and some of those key areas of Cambridgeshire, which really, you know, yeah, absolutely interlinked with what I'm gonna talk about. So what I am going to talk about is the land use framework work that we are looking at the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission. And fundamentally, that is about creating a framework to aid decision making about how land is used. So recognising that there's lots of challenges and pressures on land, and we've heard a lot about them specifically in Cambridgeshire just now, but often how they don't work together, and that there's you know, there's a lot of clashes between those, and some things are planned very, very specifically, and some things are not. Some things are planned at a national level, some are county, some much smaller. So actually, how do some of those plans, some of those strategies, you know, even things like net zero, how does that actually start to impact on what things look like on the ground? And we, as I say, heard lots about these issues, but looking at it, I guess, as land as the limiting and perhaps also enabling factor, and looking at it through that lens. So that as a concept is a key part of the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission's work, and we actually look at it at a national level, and we have a national group on that, looking at it across the board, but specifically looking to sort of pilot and give it a go, if you like, at a county level in Cambridgeshire, on the basis that a lot of those decisions are made at a county level, and that seemed as good a boundary as any to sort of get started with. Just for context, we're also looking at it in Devon as well. So what a land use framework looks like in Devon. And I think, yeah, interesting to see. It's quite, so far iterative process. It's about working with people, and actually how it develops is may well be similar, but also maybe it'll be different because land is obviously fundamentally a local issue. So yeah, and I'm, as you said, I'm Alice, so I coordinate this work in Cambridgeshire, and that work is led by our Dame Fiona Reynolds, and also who is our co-chair for the County of Cambridgeshire, and also Gavin Shelton, who's the other co-chair, has been heavily involved in that. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what we've done so far, I suppose, and where that's got to, and then sort of the next steps. So the first thing we did was have a meeting on the 10th of September in Emmanuel College with about 60 industry people with a connection to land, and a huge amount of you on this call, which is brilliant to see. So I know lots of you were there, and just to thank you again for your input in that meeting, and looking at the pressures on land in Cambridgeshire, things like farming, which we've heard more about, infrastructure, water, transport, nature planning, trying to cover off some of those key issues, and looked at mapping what some of the pressure points of those were in Cambridgeshire, which involved a lot of maps and tracing paper and post-its, and a good sense of humour for trying to make that work together. So, and what was clear from that, is that there's a heck of a lot going on in Cambridgeshire, and it's a county under pressure. And that was really, the main outcome of the meeting, that there's a county under pressure, and also that there's a genuine interest from everybody in some sort of collaborative way of looking at it from that sort of land perspective in a more strategic way. So that garnered that support to sort of continue, that it was worth giving it a go, and that for the time being, the Food Farming and Countryside Commission were the ones to take that forward. We then sort of key things since then that we've been working on is largely about gathering support, and comment from you, Richard, just about the other work, that this stuff only works if people want it to, and actually you've got some buy-in from the key players within that. So just to pick out for you, obviously Natural Cambridgeshire being a really core partner, great to have your sort of official support the other day for a letter. And similarly from the Cambridgeshire County Council, Lorna Dupre has been quite involved so far, and they were keen to offer their support to look at this further. And also GE's National Trust and the Peatland soil work that we've just been hearing about, that actually these things are all part of the same problem and picture. We've also been having lots of meetings behind the scenes and with different people, just to explain what the work is and understand different people's priorities. So that's been a really key part of it. And then in terms of progress, we've developed a leadership group, which again, lots of the people on the call are involved with, and we met on the 18th of November. That was a group of 25 people, but I'm keen to stress that that remains quite a fluid group. So it's by no means a closed shop. So if not everybody we invited could come on the day, and equally there's going to be other people that we need to involve at different parts of the process, which we're very keen to do so. This has to be a collaborative project. So for that meeting, we developed some next steps, which were largely around data gathering and running some listening events. We discussed these with the leadership group. And they're the two things really that I'm working on at the moment. That data gathering piece, I don't need to tell you all how much fantastic work there is in Cambridgeshire, trying to solve some of these issues, trying to map them, trying to understand them, as well as how many plans and policies and strategies that are currently ongoing that need we need to know about if we're looking at this. So the first thing we did at the leadership group was ask, what are these that we need to be aware of, and what are the key ones that are going to have an impact. So we gathered a huge amount of data from that, and we've been organising and exploring that. And we're going to send that out back to the leadership group this week for another round of iterations and to see what's, where the holes are, what almost where the holes are that we know about, what we're literally missing, and then also what areas, where the gaps are in the county where the work hasn't been done, and it should be. So yes, and then we're keen to start looking at how we can start mapping those perhaps onto each other, or understanding how they interact, and got a few ideas that we work with the Geospatial Commission down in Devon and on our national group, so the impact influence that they can have, but yeah, that's sort of one of the sort of core starting points. And then the other thing is around listening events, which is largely about sort of trying to hear from the people of Cambridgeshire and understand the character of Cambridgeshire. So if you like, the leadership group is trying to offer a strategic view of some of the key issues. So, people within that group are representing certain priorities in the area, water obviously being a key one, planning, farming, and also have a slightly strategic view on the county or a patch of that. But what we're also keen to do is understand people's priorities in Cambridgeshire, and how does that part of the puzzle fit in? What do people who live here actually want from the place that they live? And that's part of the puzzle, the strategic view is part of the puzzle, and how do those things sort of fit together? Also aware of the fantastic work of Climate Change Commission and other work that's been done, and we're really keen not to recreate this because there's no point. And also, so we're targeting our efforts in that sort of slightly more iterative way. So what that looks like is us hopefully travelling around to a number of places in Cambridgeshire and visiting groups and trying to hear the less heard voices of Cambridgeshire as well, via potentially different community groups and farming groups and different types of people and with different priorities in Cambridgeshire. And up to 15 of those, and hoping to do those in March. We've sort of been drafting a bit of proposal following the feedback that we got from the leadership group about this. And again, that should be going out this week, and we can share that this week. So that's a little bit about where we're at. As I mentioned, it's it's an iterative process. It's based on collaboration and buy-in. What we hear is that there's fantastic work ongoing in Cambridgeshire, and we're keen to stress that it's not about recreating that. It's trying to put a strategic view on it and looking at it from a land perspective, and been really encouraged by the support that we've had of people looking for actually someone who's looking at all those key issues. And that's fundamentally what we're looking to do. I'll make sure my email goes in the chat, because as I say, there's lots of names on here that I recognise that are already engaged. But if it's not something, if this is the first time you've heard about it and you'd like to hear more, I can very easily send over information, or we can set up a meeting with myself or Dame Fiona to sort of explore it a bit more, because we're keen to work with everybody and keen to help where we can get it.
Okay.
Thanks, Richard.
No, Alice, that's great. Thank you. And I think as you referenced earlier, certainly Natural Cambridgeshire is hugely supportive of this, and we were very keen that it also be referenced in the Climate Commission's recommendations, that we whether it's this piece of work or something else, we can't be too precious, but something that allows us to understand how we use land and how we manage land is vital if we're going to achieve our full environmental and water and air quality aspirations. There's a comment from Nick Sanford, representing both Peterborough City Council and the Woodland Trust, about whether there's a danger that this is too focused on rural areas. How would this kind of work play into the urban communities, recognizing that certainly up here in the north, 80% of the population live in an urban area?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, and it's that balance between the proportion of land is is rural, but the proportion of people are urban, and how do you cross-reference that? And I think that's something we're particularly keen to pick up in those listening events, and a lot of them are in urban areas, and to the extent actually where I made the point, we need to make sure that we're reflecting the requirements of rural people as well, and that's yes, so that's a really key part of the point of those listening events, is hearing from where people live and what they want from their area. Yeah, sometimes those aren't as obviously connected to land, because it's sort of the buildings around you.
The way I would say, actually, I think it's a very important point, because I see somebody else saying that we are a predominantly rural area, but I think it's a very big part of Natural Cambridgeshire's agenda that we have to understand how the rural areas can bring benefits to the urban areas. Access to nature, the health benefits, obviously the nature biodiversity benefits are hugely important. And many centres of population are actually very poor in terms of their access to nature statistics. And actually, some of the most rural areas don't have a lot of accessible countryside, because there aren't as many parks or country parks or footpaths. So it's something that we do have to look at extremely closely and be mindful of. I mean, top of my head, I would have thought about a quarter of the population of the county lives in the two cities. And then if you add the market towns into that, it's a massively important part of everything we need to do, and we mustn't lose sight of. So thanks for that, Alice. Other questions? One question was around, is there anything we need to do to sort of map this work into sort of thinking around the Oxcam arc at all, Alice? Is that something you'll be looking at?
Yes, we are, and have had various, I can't quite remember the acronym, but had various discussions with people working on the Oxcam arc, and their sort of plans and policies, and again trying to just, a lot of it is about people talking to each other, personally, especially at this point in time. So yes, we've engaged with people in working in that area, definitely. Yeah.
Absolutely, thanks, Alice. And again, another question from Jane in the chat there, which I think strikes to the heart of it all. How do we ensure that the densification of existing and new settlements strikes the right balance between the rurality of our areas and also there's other ambitions? But I think that's exactly the point of what you're trying to do, isn't it, Alice? To ensure.
Yeah, it is, and I think where we've it's a tricky thing sometimes to get your head around, and it's not for us to say what or the framework to say what that balance is and what's right in different areas. That's not necessarily what we're trying to go as far as to do, but it's trying to understand from the people in the area what their priority is and what they think the area should look like, and then that's part of the decision making process when you're making changes in areas. And it's none of this is as simple as I'm saying, but it's understanding what the different priorities are in different areas, and making sure that those are borne in mind when we're making decisions, or that they're used as an indicator.
Yeah, I'm just reminded, because there was a question about mapping here. I'm just reminded that as part of the Future Parks project, I saw a beautiful map of the accessible sort of parks and nature reserves across Peterborough and Cambridgeshire. And what I found very powerful about that, the power of mapping, was you could see where there were huge gaps, and the sort of work that we're talking about, Alice, through your work, is where we can look at those gaps and see where there actually are deficiencies, where we don't have access to nature, and that is a problem for everybody if we don't have access to nature in the countryside, as explained earlier. So mapping, I think, will be a huge part of this.
Yeah, absolutely. Understanding those gaps and differences, between the county and the livelihoods of people in different areas within Cambridge itself, and different areas within Cambridgeshire, in terms of what people want from their surroundings.
Lovely, thank you. So what's the sort of the next crucial step, Alice, is bringing those people together and having those conversations? Is that right?
Yeah, so we've got another leadership group on meeting scheduled for the 3rd of March, when we're hoping to, we've started to synthesise some of this information and notice the Greater Cambridgeshire Local Plan, which obviously as part of that, and bring those ideas together. We're then going to do a bit of research, as again there was a question about integrating mapping systems. We're doing a bit of research on how we can start to do those sort of things, and try and integrate some of this information. and then we're going to put that back to the group at the next meeting. Equally, we're hoping to have done some of these listening events and started to understand what the different priorities are within the county. That's sort of the next stages at the moment, and then starting to understand what a framework looks like. How can we put it into a useful format that it actually gets used within the county, and start to develop that further.
Very good. Well, lovely, Alison. As I say, we're very, very keen to support you in that work, and again also to make sure that we coordinate it all and connect it up. One of my slight fears at the moment is there's so much going on. We do need to make sure it all comes together. In actual fact, again, I go back to it. I think that's one of the things your work does. So it's very helpful.
Yeah,
excellent.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much indeed for that, and thank you for all the questions in the chat. I apologise if we don't get to all of them. Hopefully you can sort of, as I've seen earlier, other people answering those questions as we go, which is great. Okay, we're going to move on now to a sort of a regular slot that we decided we'd sort of introduce to these forums, where we ask one of our key partners to update us on the work that they're doing. And you see how seamlessly Helen and I work these days. It's quite incredible, isn't it? This time round, we're delighted that Sarah Smith from the National Trust has agreed to join us. She's got a gorgeous photo to set things off. Sarah is also one of the trustees of Natural Cambridgeshire, and the National Trust are one of our main supporters, and we're very privileged to have them on board. And they've also, of course, got this unique place just down the road, which I'm sure Sarah will tell us about. Sarah, over to you.
Morning, Richard. Thank you for the introduction. For those of you that don't know me, yes, my name is Sarah Smith, and I'm a General Manager for the National Trust, covering the Fenland portfolio of properties. I'm also a very local girl. I've worked for Fenland Nature Conservation organisations for around 17 years, and I grew up in the Cambridgeshire Fens as a carrot farmer's daughter. So I know this patch fairly well, but today I'm going to talk to you about land and nature and our strategy in Cambridgeshire for the National Trust. So if I have the next slide, please, Helen. So first of all, zooming out to look at the National Trust on a national basis, we've recognised land and nature and the climate change crisis as two of our priority areas over the next decade. And so we're going to be focusing on these across all areas of our work. And we've got some key targets, which I've listed some here, which include being carbon net zero by 2030. We're going to be planting 20 million trees this decade. We're going to be ensuring that our nature areas of national and international significance are in good condition, as well as creating and restoring 25,000 hectares of priority habitat by 2025, and ensuring all of our land is in high nature status. So that's us on a national basis. That's our plan. And if I could have the next slide, please, Helen. So how are we delivering on that in Cambridgeshire? I'm going to talk to you today about 4 key properties that are delivering on our land and nature strategy. These are Wicken Fen, Wimpole Estate, Anglesey Abbey and Houghton Mill. Next slide, thank you, Helen. So I want to start at Wicken Fen, place very close to my heart. This nature reserve is an incredibly special place, one to experience if you've never been. The first 2 acres of Wicken were purchased in 1899, and this made it the National Trust's first nature reserve and only its 5th acquisition as a fledgling charity. It's been recognised by Natural England as the most diverse site in the UK, with over 9,300 species recorded. And the core of Wicken Fen rests upon 3 metres of undrained peat. It's one of 4 sites that make up the remaining original undrained East Anglian fen, and less than 0.2% of that original fen remains. It's also an incredibly popular nature reserve, with over 70,000 people passing through our visitor centre each year, and more than that are accessing the public rights of way network that extends across the wider nature reserve as well. Thank you. So from those first 2 acres, over the next 100 years, Wicken Fen increased to about 350 hectares. But the Trust also noticed that the nature reserve was under threat. Species were in decline. The fen had become an isolated area for nature, impacted by the drainage happening around it that was creating the valuable farmland on the precious peatland soils. The number of visitors accessing the nature reserve was also having an impact. So in 1999, we launched the Wicken Fen Vision, and this is a 100-year plan to extend the nature reserve all the way to Cambridge, potentially increasing the size of the area for nature from those 350 hectares in 1999 to over 5,000. Thank you. So you can see on this map here the extent of National Trust land ownership, which is in the darker green colour, with Wicken Fen up in the north there, and the aspirational vision area in paler green, which reaches all the way down to the A14 on the edge of Cambridge. You can also see another National Trust site at Anglesey Abbey sitting within the vision area. Next slide. So when we established the vision, we adopted a different management approach to that which we take on the SSSI. In order to manage what may one day extend to over 50 square kilometres, we needed a less intensive approach. And we do this through a form of rewilding. We're restoring natural processes, primarily halting drainage and introducing grazing. This grazing introduces disturbance, and by moving extensively over large areas, Arconic horses and Highland cattle are supporting and creating a mosaic of different and changing habitats. This approach allows nature to make the best decisions at every turn to the conditions around it, which will ensure the landscape can adapt and be resilient in the changing climate. It's also very sustainable, both from a carbon and a financial perspective. We're not burning fossil fuels with management machinery, nor are we digging holes in the remaining peat reserves and releasing this carbon. Thank you. So what have we achieved since 1999? Well, the first 20 years have been fantastic. We've doubled the size of the nature reserve. We now have, and we've created 400 hectares of new priority habitat, taking the nature reserve up to 800 hectares in size. We've seen the return of some iconic fenland species, such as cranes, otters, water voles, the return of some species of dragonfly, as well as dung beetles. People are also at the heart of our vision, and we've created and improved 48 kilometres worth of access. We have a cycle hire operation, boat trips, and a small back to basics campsite. And over 1 million visitors came to Wicken Fen in those first 20 years. We've also seen on the restored areas how we've managed to reduce soil carbon emissions by 80% and slow the rate of peat loss on the areas of land that we've restored. Thank you. So looking forward, we arranged the work that we're doing on the vision under 5 different work streams, and these you can see listed below here. The first, land and nature, is about increasing space for nature. This can be working with landowners in partnership as well as acquiring new land. Secondly, everyone is welcome. We're working really hard to increase the diversity of people who visit Wicken Fen and the surrounding area by providing access, by making nature relevant, and by ensuring that local communities benefit from what we're doing. Under research and learning, we're continually monitoring and researching the impact of our management decisions, learning from this and sharing widely. Our sustainable economy is about supporting an economy and local business that support nature in the local area. And finally, climate action. This is about reducing our carbon footprint, adapting to becoming more resilient and capturing more carbon on our land. Next slide, thank you. So moving away from Wicken Fen, I'm going to let you know a little bit about Wimpole Estate now. So as well as a popular visitor destination, it is a working estate which includes a profit-making farm. It's a sustainable mixed farming system where the priorities are looking after soils, wildlife features, and looking after water resources. So it includes an organic arable farm as well as a livestock operation. Next slide, thank you, Helen. And Wimpole is one of the properties at the heart of the Trust's green recovery. It was very fortunate this year to receive £1.3 million of funding from the Green Recovery Challenge Fund. And this has enabled it to restore areas of nature. So there's going to be new areas of woodland, wood pasture, agroforestry and ponds. Most of the ponds have been dug this year already, and we're about to embark on the planting of 100,000 trees this winter, some of that through the support of the local community, but also using contractors as well. The team at Wimpole have delivered over 80 engagement events around nature this year and undertaken a whole operation review of the whole estate's carbon footprint, as well as a soil carbon study to better understand our emissions. Next slide, thank you, Helen. Moving across to Anglesey Abbey. Anglesey Abbey has got smaller opportunities around restoring areas for nature, but it is a county wildlife site, and they are restoring 12 hectares of priority habitat over the next couple of years. However, one of the big opportunities with Anglesey Abbey is connecting visitors with nature. And they have over 400,000 of those visitors coming per year, not too far from the edge of Cambridge. And particularly the work that they do with families, introducing families to the outdoor through their wild play areas at Hoe Fen. It's a great introduction to people exploring the wider landscape. And as you saw from the earlier map, sits in the Wycombe Fen vision, so it creates a really nice gateway for people to start exploring their local area. Thank you, Helen. And finally, across to Houghton Mill, which is near St Ives. This is on the River Great Ouse, and it's one of the last remaining, or it is the last remaining working water mill on the River Great Ouse. Now, as far as land holding is concerned, it's a very small corner of the National Trust's ownership, but it has an enormous number of visitors for its size. Over 100,000 people per year come to visit the campsites, the tea room and the car park, as well as the historic mill. It's an increasing green tourism destination and provides a fantastic gateway to the Ouse Valley for walkers, cyclists, boaters and increasingly paddle boarders. Excellent, thank you, Helen. And that's a quick whistle-stop tour around the National Trust properties at Cambridgeshire that are delivering on our land and nature strategy. So as ever, I'm more than happy to take questions. Those 4 properties, I'll say that Wycombe Fen and Houghton Mill are 2 of the properties on my patch. So I do work closely with the Anglesey Abbey and Wimpole general managers, but my depth of knowledge is not quite as deep with regard to those. So I may have to pass some of those questions on after the end of today. Thank you very much.
Fabulous, thank you, Sarah. I mean, I've only got one question for you. It's very simple. When are you going to get a big property up near Peterborough? Because this isn't fair. You've got some fantastic things going on down there. So, and I want to come and visit them, but then I'd be using lots of carbon to get there.
We'd love to do more, and we recognise that there are some gaps. So yeah, I'll keep my eyes open for you.
Yeah, if you could let somebody know. Thanks, Sarah. On a much more serious note, John has asked a better question than mine. Green prescribing project at Wimpole, is that something that's going on? Is that do you know about that?
I know that is something that is going on. Unfortunately, that's not something I know any more detail than that on, but it's something that I can grab a little bit more information from my colleagues over at Wimpole if that would be of interest.
Yeah, thank you. Another question I had on, again, on a more serious note, with the vision for Wycombe Fen, what sort of reaction do you get from landowners and farmers? Do they feel threatened by that? I mean, because you're quite explicit about where the map is, so you could see whether it's your land that's part of this vision. And obviously you're proposing something that is very different to how they farm at the moment. So what sort of relationship do you have with your neighbours?
Positive, negative, and everything in between. Okay. I think Richard is a fair assessment of what we have. I mean, there's over 100 landowners in that vision area, and some of whom we've done an awful lot of close work with over the last 20 years. Some of whom we've had the briefest amount of contact to, and it's not been something that they've been interested in. But one of the things about the vision is it is about the long-term game as well. We're working over 100-year timescale as well. So whilst I know that there are doors that have been closed to some of the landowners in the area in the time that I've been with the trust, I kind of see my role as if I can nudge a little bit of an opening in that door, if I can sow some of those seeds, it might be the general manager in 40, 50 years time who is dealing with the next generation of landowners who will be operating in far different circumstances to that which we are now. That I might be laying the groundwork for the general manager of the future, even if it's not me that can open that door now. But equally, you know, as we all know, the world has changed significantly. I've been at the National Trust for nearly 5 years now, and the changes I've seen around attitudes to climate change, to the biodiversity crisis, to the changes we're seeing around agri-environment and land management practices, there's always going to be change, and we need to continue having those conversations and building that trust and building those relationships. And whilst we're not necessarily saying that what we're doing on our land at the National Trust is the answer for everyone, and not the answer for everyone within the Wick and Fen Vision area even. It's one way of tackling this crisis, and it's a way that when I look at it, I see that is what the land in the area needs from us now. The general managers of the past were making very different decisions. The general managers of the future may be looking at the next chapter. But it's about starting those conversations now and not procrastinating anymore, really.
And it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I think everything comes back to balance at the end. You talked particularly with great pride about the visitor numbers that are coming to Wick and Fen, and I'm sure, as you've already pointed out, many of those are cycling, coming on by boat. But in addition, though, when you look at Wimpole and Anglesey and yourselves, there's a lot of people coming to visit you by car. What's the National Trust thinking about this? Because I'm really struggle with this one, because honestly we want people to visit our wild spaces. We want them to enjoy them, and of course, because they're wild, they're rather remote. They don't necessarily sit on a very busy bus route. Where's the National Trust thinking on this?
It's a really big issue for a lot of our places, and it's something that we're tackling under our climate action agenda. We want to make it easier for people to reach us where they can, particularly there are some, so Houghton Mill, for example, is a property where we've got some quicker wins there that we can make with encouraging people to use sustainable transport. We're very close to bus routes. We're on cycleways that lead to some of the bigger urban areas. Wick and Fen is a lot more isolated and a bit more of a challenge. Having said that, the train station at Soham here opened this week, because we had our first visitor on Monday who travelled to Soham train station and walked to Wick and Fen. So the options are opening up all the time, and that it's something that we need to work with wider partners to make sure that we're building those links and making the most of those opportunities where they are.
It is a difficult one, but it's good to hear about the first rail passenger. That is good news. Although I suspect they were
very excited to tell us when they came in that what they'd done on Monday morning.
Excellent. There's a couple of things in the chat. I encourage everyone to pick up on Edward Groom's point about registering any tree planting with the Queen's Green Canopy map, and Edward's got his contacts there. We can work with him on that. Yeah, that's an interesting one from Martin Baker. Does the car debate change with a move to electric vehicles or EV carpools? I don't know whether that's a fair question just for you, Sarah. It's a big one for everyone, isn't it? If we're all driving electric cars, does that solve the problem? I don't know. It probably, in part, but there's probably issues alongside the construction of the cars, etc., etc. So perhaps, Martin, I'm going to leave that one. It's too big a question for us. Sorry. Good. Okay. There's a few comments that in there that Sarah might want to have a look at about safe cycling tracks, etc. But I think we're going to leave it there, Sarah, and just offer you a big thank you for that presentation. But most importantly, for all the work that you and the National Trust team and your volunteers do. It's a huge contribution to our doubling nature ambitions. You know, what you're doing at Wicken in particular is vital if we're going to achieve that long-term ambition. and it truly is a wonderful place to visit anyway. So thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Richard.
Great stuff. Well, we're starting to lose a few people because of time, which is absolutely fine. And we're going to sort of move now to the sort of introspection bit. So you can all leave if you like. And we're sort of just a bit of a review of Natural Cambridgeshire's work over the course of the last 12 months. I'm pretty sure it is the case that in advance of this meeting, you both had a copy of our activities report and also our State of Nature report, which I wanted to thank Peter Lansop in particular for taking the time and energy to deliver that document, and Helen and the rest of the team for the Natural Cambridgeshire activities document. I can't see many faces, but can you sort of just, I'm going to presume everyone has had those documents. And what I want to do in the space of the next quarter of an hour, and probably no more, and then we can all go and have a cup of coffee or our lunch, is just to sort of do a little bit of summary from my personal perspective about Natural Cambridgeshire's work over the last 12 months. I will keep that reasonably brief because it's in the documents, and I'll also be happy to take any questions. And then I think I'm going to ask Roger just to update us on one or two governance aspects of our work, and particularly around trustees. Is that right, Roger? You're happy with that? Thumbs up. Lovely. Thank you. Great. So yeah, the activities report is perhaps where I'll start, and it's very important, I think, to stress that Natural Cambridgeshire, and just be careful, I'm kind of got my tongue in my cheek here when I say this, Natural Cambridgeshire doesn't do anything. It's our partners that do. Look, Helen's looking grim already. It's our partners that do the do. We are a partnership. We're not a delivery body, and that's why it's so useful to have the State of Nature report, sort of summarising the work of so many of those partners, and we'd be delighted to keep expanding that year on year and include more partners. So because we want to recognise everybody's work as they try and take that doubling nature ambition forward. And I think what that report does is it tells us there's an awful lot going on across the county, and a lot of initiatives in place, some of them extremely big, such as the work on places like Wycombe Fen and Great Fen, huge ambitions there, and some of them very small in terms of the community projects that are listed by organisations like PECT or Langdyke or Nean Park or Cambridge Past, Present and Future. There's a great range there between people planting a tree and organisations planting tens of thousands of trees or creating wetlands. And one of the things that State of Nature report doesn't necessarily do, of course, is then look at all the individual landowners and farmers and schools who are all playing their part, and we want to recognise that and be clear about that. And I think if we look at our activities over the 12 months, we've been blessed by being in a position for the first time since we registered as a charity, just to answer Anthony Cooper's question in the chat, which went through, Roger, was it December or January this year, I think, wasn't it? I think we became a charity in January. It's somewhere around there, either December or January. I'm pretty sure it's actually January, but anyway. Is that we have had the opportunity to employ Helen for now about 14 months. Is it, Helen? Is that about right? Something like that. 1 year, exactly a year, to help us take forward our activity. And that came about because many of our partners volunteered to put funding into the charity to give us more resource to take our work forward further and faster. And those I won't name all of those organisations now. They're listed in the back of the activity report, and we're very grateful for that financial support. And many of those organisations have continued that into the next financial year, which gives us a little bit more security about our longer term plans. And obviously the focus of everything we do crystallises around doubling nature. That's what we want to do. We define that as doubling the amount of land that is actively managed and successfully managed for nature across Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. And our role is to champion that objective and to chivvy and chase and influence and spread best practice. And I think what I would say over the course of that last 12 months, and it's for you to judge whether that's through our efforts or through serendipity and other issues, is that agenda, the doubling nature agenda, has very much and quite dramatically moved up the sort of the policy agenda and the sort of the policy focus. I think it's fair to say now that we have the combined authority and all the local authorities firmly on board and supportive in policy terms of that agenda. And as we see new planning policies and local plans coming forward, we're seeing doubling nature written into them as an objective, and that's incredibly positive too. And as a result of all that, I think it's fair to say that the policy agenda, both nationally and locally, has never been more favourable. And I think we saw some of that in the presentations earlier, some of the exciting things we heard from DEFRA, some of the exciting things we heard from John in terms of the fen and soil projects, and also from the recommendations of the Independent Commission on Climate Change, which was very clear in those initial and final recommendations that doubling nature is certainly one of the most important ways in which we can mitigate the impact of climate change. It also turns out to be one of the most popular, and the research we did as part of that commission greatly endorsed that people see the doubling nature agenda, and I'm being honest with you here, putting this in context, as a very positive thing that, you know, what's not to like, and which many people want to embrace and get involved in. Whereas other aspects of the climate change agenda can be seen as quite challenging, and more about sort of having to change our way of life. Now, obviously, you know, I'm sure everybody on this call recognises that, but for some people, those changes are challenging. And I think it's therefore interesting that the Climate Change Commission's report was entitled Fairness and Nature in its final report. So from a policy point of view, we're delighted that you know, the new mayor is continuing to support our agenda as the previous mayor did, and that the administrations across the area are supporting that agenda. So we see with that local level policy, and with all the various initiatives coming out of DEFRA, that there really is an opportunity to take things forward. If you've read my sort of introduction to our report there, you'll note that there's a real caution though in that, because to date, I still think we're not playing at the right level and the right intensity of delivery. And I think that's where we have to get to now, is to channel those policies and the support and the warm words into real practical delivery on the ground, so that this time next year, our partners and ourselves as sort of the umbrella body that brings them together can really be pointing to major impacts on the ground as we restore habitats, create new ones, and give people more opportunities to access more and more thriving nature. And at the moment, I don't think it's our delivery rates are high enough, and I don't think Cambridgeshire is sort of necessarily any further along this line than any other county in the country, whereas we know that for us that need is probably one of the most pressing. Two fundamental reasons: we are one of, if not the most nature depleted county in the country, and secondly, that growth agenda is one of the biggest in the country, and we need to make sure that we are not ignoring in any way the environmental impacts of that, and that we are building a stronger and more resilient environment across Cambridgeshire going forward. So our message to the policymakers and to our friends and partners who are on this call is that we really do have to get the foot to the pedal, although that's probably rather carbon-rich analysis these days, but we have to accelerate the speed at which we deliver things. And that's why we're working very closely now with the Combined Authority on the idea of launching a Doubling Nature Fund, and we have outlined some ideas on that in the document. For us, this will be a long-term, multi-million-pound fund designed to take forward our landscape scale projects, our community projects, our urban projects, and to make sure that for all, you know, they can see the benefits of doubling nature. That fund would be a public and private fund. We'd be looking for some seed core money from our public partners and major investment from our private partners, as well as bringing in other income streams such as the new biodiversity net gain, possibly elms, and other opportunities to create the funding that we need. And in that way, to simplify things by having a single portal for investment in the natural world. So those conversations are happening with the support of the Combined Authority. Proposals for the fund are in the budget that the Combined Authority is currently consulting on. So we're hopeful that we can make real progress with that. And I'd like to thank everybody involved in that piece of work. I'm conscious that I'm sort of rambling on a little bit too long now. I just wanted to point to one other aspect of our work that I think we've really taken forward this year, and I'd like to see accelerated next, and that's around community nature recovery. On the one hand, there's those sort of big projects that take many years and many millions of pounds to deliver. But on the other, if every community, urban and rural, in the county and Peterborough was delivering its own local nature recovery plan, then that would make a difference too. And this year we've seen some real successes with our pilot projects up in the John Clare countryside near Peterborough, and also through the delivery of a whole range of projects that we funded working with the Future Parks Accelerator project across the county. And this has seen communities just getting out there, putting up bird boxes, bug boxes, planting trees and hedges. And that's going to make a real difference too. And it's something we will be prioritising next year, because we have to have local people championing, espousing our cause, but also getting their hands dirty and making a difference themselves. So for us, those I think will be our main focuses in the next year, building on the work we've done this year, doubling Nature Fund, the Communities Fund, and driving forward our landscape scale projects. So I'm just going to pause there. I can see a number of questions in the chat, which I'll come back to. While I digest those, I'll just ask Roger perhaps just to update us on governance, and then we'll come back to those questions if that's okay. It's a little bit difficult to speak and do the questions at the same time, so I'm just going to take some time to read the questions and then come back to you. Roger, is that okay with you?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. Okay, thanks, Richard. Well, this is the dull but essential bit of an AGM, so I'll try and keep it short. Yeah, we did become a charity on the 8th of January 21, according to the Charity Commission, after a bit of a fight, as some of you will know, getting our terms right. So we're a charitable incorporated organisation, the foundation model, which means that only trustees vote. But that doesn't mean to say that the board does not listen to the forum members, and we're always open to ideas and inputs. So at the last board meeting, we, according to our terms of reference, we had to set aside. We had to do various things with terms of reference and re-election of trustees. Everything was passed unanimously. I'll tell you that now. And there was also some nimble footwork to keep a quorum, because most of the trustees had to stand down according to the Charity Commission's model constitution. So the first thing we did was to set aside the existing terms of reference, because they were written before we actually wrote our constitution and didn't quite agree. With that, we agreed to do that, and we're going to rewrite our terms of reference. For those who don't follow these governance things in detail, you have a terms of reference or rules to actually refine points of the constitution. It doesn't mean to say you change them, but it just more procedural points. All the first trustees of Natural Cambridgeshire stood down and all wanted to be offered themselves for re-election, except Carly Leonard from Peterborough Environment City Trust. We're sorry to see her go, but Carly's got very hard pressed with lots of other things. So Carly has stood down as our treasurer. The rest were unanimously re-elected. At that point in the agenda, we'd actually appointed 4 trustees since the initial trustees we formed the charity, and those 4 trustees managed the meeting. After that point, we then had to re-elect members of the Financial Operations Committee. This is a small group of 4 people who actually do the sort of sub-management of the actual governance of the trust and other matters, and that is the chair, the deputy chair, the secretary, which is myself acting, and the treasurer, which was Carly. And it was agreed that we should have a re-elected Financial Operations Committee, and we wanted 2 other members of the board to join us. We didn't have elections at that moment, so it was agreed that for the time being, until we have our next board meeting and have a procedure for re-electing the officers of Natural Cambridgeshire, we will serve as an acting group. And the last thing, which applies to the forum generally, is that we have actually a number of our constitution allows us to go to 20 trustees, which is rather a lot. We actually have, I think, 7 vacancies at the moment, and so we decided we would like to offer 3 more trustee board positions to members of the forum, and we will come back to the forum with the means of you offering yourselves to serve on the board, and how this will be done in due course. So we thought 3 to start with, and leave us sort of 4 spaces as it were, to cope with any other people we'd probably want to attract to the board in future. And I think, Richard, that's it.
Lovely. Thank you, Roger. Very helpful indeed. So it's a very important part of what we wanted to talk about today, is that obviously we are looking for other trustees to join the board from the Partnership Forum, people who are committed to our agenda and can make a contribution to our work. So we will be back with you in January with details of how to do that. But if you are interested, do contact us in advance, so at least we know who you are, and we can have that in mind. Just to address a couple of the questions then in the chat, there was one about doubling nature and elms being funded by development. I'm not aware that that's the case. I think elms is not funded by development. John, is that the case? It's direct government from. It will be funded directly by the government, won't it?
Elm is very much a public sector funded scheme, so entirely separate from developer funding. That's right.
I thought that was the case, and the point here is that we believe that the doubling nature agenda is something that will need to be funded from a multiplicity of sources. You know, the place where most nature will be doubled is on what is working with landowners and farmers to look at how we take forward more nature-friendly farming. So some of those public funds around elms will be crucial, and the whole future of land use and agricultural policy is crucial to what we do. There is also a development agenda, and developers, as they create homes for people or offices for people to work in, whatever it may be, they will now have obligations to pay in under the biodiversity net gain procedure, which means that they will have to deliver at least 110% of the biodiversity that was on the site beforehand. So there will be funding schemes through that as well. And we're also looking for funding schemes through philanthropy and through community action and through grants. So our community work that we talked about earlier, we'll be looking to go to grant making trusts to get that money so that we can support communities with their work. So if we're going to double nature, it will require a huge amount of funding from multiplicity of sources, not just from, in fact, from development. I think that's one part of it, but it was certainly not how we would achieve our aims. I think, Tim, you've got your hand up. Did you want to come in at all?
Just to say that whilst I agree totally with what John said, I do remember from my times working with government that I think when it comes to the higher levels of elm, i.e. landscape recovery, I think they do have an aspiration to try and see whether they can get some private funding drawn into it as well. Because frankly, I don't think there's going to be enough money. And so I wouldn't be surprised if we heard that.
I think we're quite clear about that. The doubling nature fund, we will need money from the public. We will need money from the government. We will need money from our statutory partners, and we will need money from the private sector. And some of that may be, as I say, philanthropy, corporate social responsibility. Some of it through such schemes as biodiversity net gain, Section 106, etc., will be from the private sector and the development industry. It's going to be a mix of different funding sources that will be required. And so I'm pretty clear about that. I can see, Wendy, you've asked again that there's a statement there from somebody, but elms, as far as we're concerned, and if you find different, then let us know that it's not a developer-funded scheme. I'm just looking through some of the other questions as I'm trying to answer as many of them as well. Another question from you as well, Wendy, was around enforcement. Yeah, it's really important, isn't it? I mean, I worry greatly that a lot of our local authority partners have been hollowed out as a result of funding cuts over the years, and we need to make sure that the planning policies that we hope will be put in place to enable the doubling nature agenda to go forward need to be supported by sufficient capacity to make sure they happen in practice. And that's something that we're very keen to see happen. We don't hold the levers of power on local government funding, though, but we can do what we can to influence and to chivvy on that, and certainly to use the goodwill and the expertise of our partners like the Wildlife Trust, and we take a great interest in all planning applications to make sure those things were done. So yes, in terms of enforcement, we'd like to make sure that, well, I kind of hope it doesn't get to enforcement, but you're right, we have to be able to manage that as well. There's some questions as well around our constitution and who votes. So we're going to, as I say, we've always envisaged that this forum would provide trustees going forward. So that will be starting in January. I'm trying to get through as many questions as I can. We're running out today. Yeah, there's a question from Julia about the complexity of variables that affect the fauna. And I think, yeah, unfortunately, nothing is ever simple. And it is about planting or creating the right habitats in the right place. Monitoring systems, the best habitats. Exactly. We've done some work on how we can measure success going forward. And that's something we'll be talking to our statutory partners with as well. Further question there was about the Natural Environment and Planning Policy Group. We do have a regular meetings and dialogue where we just discuss planning, our ambitions in terms of planning policy. We do not, I should be clear about this, we do not comment on any individual planning applications whatsoever. We will comment on strategic local plans at that level, but not on individual plans. And you'll obviously understand that our main input on all of those is to see doubling nature and biodiversity writ large in any aspect of future local plans, either at the spatial level or at the district level. So I'm very conscious that we are nearly at 12 o'clock. I'm very happy because I can see a lot more questions. If anyone wants to email me direct, I will be happily answer those as far as I can. I'm not trying to shy away from anything. If I've missed anything, I apologize. It really is just a question of trying to get through. I wanted then, because I'm losing a lot of people, as I can see, we're down to about 50 people, to bring the meeting to a close. And thank you all very much indeed for not only attending today, but also being with us throughout the last 12 months and helping champion this cause. So Wendy, the AGM is actually held by the trustees, not at this forum. It's the trustees that hold the annual general meeting themselves, or rather, as part of it's the governance of the charity. But I'm happy to send you our constitution so that you can see that. So this isn't the AGM itself. It's a report on that AGM. Roger, have I got that right? Just making sure. He's gone. Yes, thank you. Finally, I just want to say a word of, so thank you all for joining us today, and just a word of thanks to my fellow trustees for all the hard work that they've put in over the last 12 months and are going to put in over the next 12 months. I look forward to working with them and with you, and a particular thanks to Helen, our hard-working coordinator, who's made such a difference to us over the last 12 months in bringing this all together and making things happen. And thank you for everybody for all the comments in the chat. You've all, I hope, got my email. If you want to email me and pick those up separately, I'm very happy to do that. Other than that, it's 11:59. I'm giving you a minute of your life back. Oh, sorry, I haven't said one thing, have I? It is that time of year. I do wish you all, of course, a very happy Christmas and a happy Christmas, hopefully enjoying nature at some stage and taking some great joy and comfort on the wonderful natural world that surrounds us. Thank you all very much. Bye.
Thank you, Richard. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Thank you.